Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Added Sugars and Non-Sugar Sweeteners, a review of current recommendations, scientific evidence, and future research needs. I'm Leslie Samay, Director of Professional Development at Great Valley Publishing, and I'm your host for today's webinar. Before we get started, I have a few points of housekeeping. First, in order to claim your credit, you have to stay with us through the entire hour-long presentation. Second, please try to use the Q&A box if you have a question related to today's content, the content of today's presentation. We'll address as many questions as we can at the end of the session. You can use the chat box feature to engage in side conversations with each other about the content with your fellow webinar attendees, or you can seek technological help from me if you need it through the chat box as well. Finally, Added Sugars and Non-Sugar Sweeteners, a review of current recommendations, scientific evidence, and future research needs, awards 1 CPEU in accordance with the Commission on Dietetic Registration's CPEU Prior Approval Program. The responsible provider for this activity is the Sugar Association. And on to our disclosures. Roseanne Rust has the following disclosures to report. She's an educational materials reviewer for the Sugar Association. Allison Silvetsky has the following disclosures to report. She's a consultant to Spindrift Beverage Company, Abbott, and Winston & Strawn LLC. Funding from non-CPE revenue for CPE planning, development, review, and/or presentation has been provided by the Sugar Association. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's webinar moderator, Roseanne Rust. Roseanne is an award-winning registered dietitian and an internationally recognized nutrition expert and author, and loves everything food. Owner of Rust Nutrition Services, she provides a variety of nutrition communication and thought leadership services to the food industry and science-based medicine organizations. Her goal is to help consumers understand more about nutrition, agriculture, food ingredients, and food processing so they can relax and enjoy eating for better health. Roseanne has published several consumer books in the For Dummies series, and she's written textbook chapters, is a contributor to Today's Dietitian magazine, and recently served as editor and project manager for the upcoming book, The GLP-1 Kitchen, 50-plus protein-packed, fiber-rich recipes for living well on weight loss medications. You can find Roseanne on social media at Chew the Facts or visit her website at rustnutrition.com. And Roseanne, I'm pleased to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Leslie, and welcome everyone. These are our learning objectives for today's webinar, but I'm going to start off with a short overview of added sugars, and then I'll introduce our speaker, Dr. Allison Silvetsky. She'll present data on sweeteners, as well as the role of non-sugar sweeteners in weight management and diet-related disease. And as a reminder, you want to use that Q&A button for your questions, and we should have about 10 minutes at the end. We'll hold the questions till the end, and we'll have about 10 minutes to review them. So over the last few decades, dietary advice and nutrition policy have heavily focused on reducing the consumption of added sugars. So what are added sugars? Well, the FDA defines added sugars as those sugars that are added to foods during processing, or sugars packaged for consumers to add to foods and beverages on their own, like your honey in your tea or a little sugar in your coffee. Added sugars do not include those that are naturally present in foods such as milk or fruits or vegetables. The 2020 and to 2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommends that infants and toddlers under the age of 2 avoid foods and beverages with added sugars. And those age 2 and over, the recommendation is to limit added sugars to less than 10% of total calories, which is about 12 teaspoons per day based on a 2,000 calorie diet. And this guideline is reflected in food labeling and nutrition policy. Now, the average American is not meeting that goal. The most recent USDA data from 2017 to 2018 show that about 12 to 13% of total calories is coming from sugar, or around 270 calories per day. But if you step back and look at USDA data from 2000 to 2018, you'll see that there's actually a decrease by more than 30% during that period. I think it's also important to note that there's no dietary reference intake for total or added sugars. So there's no RDA or upper limit. And this slide just gives you a picture of some of the added sugars as defined by the FDA when you're looking at product labels. And that third column is an example of sugars that can be naturally present, but also added during processing. So how much is too much? I find it really interesting that while the public often obsesses over certain nutrients or food ingredients, people forget about personalizing portions. I think that 12 teaspoons a day kind of gets pushed out there as sort of a rule and reshared on social media, but it's not taking into consideration individual calorie needs. So as nutrition practitioners, we need to understand what the data is actually reporting. So you'll see here in 1999, Americans consumed 90.5 pounds of sugar per year per capita. And that's USDA availability data adjusted for loss. But over the past 2 decades, there's been a decline in sugar intake, with consumption in 2023 down to 72.9 pounds per capita per year. You know, I also see a lot of messaging on social media kind of blaming the dietary guidelines for poor health, but we know Americans are not following all of them. You know, the recommendation for 10% of calories per day from added sugar is pretty reasonable, and we have to remember everyone's needs are different. So that 12 teaspoons a day looks different for, you know, a teenage boy that's running cross country and they need upwards to 3,000 calories. So personalization definitely matters. And for every action, there's a reaction. Despite the significant decrease in sugar over the years, obesity continues to rise. So are added sugars the problem? How do non-sugar sweeteners impact energy intake and weight management? Are there any unforeseen consequences with the push to reduce sugar in foods and beverages? And I think that while consumers may view products that are labeled as lower in sugar or reduced sugar or sugar-free as a good thing, they may not be aware that those products are not always calorie-free or lower in calories. And I think they are not aware, and even as practitioners, we sometimes forget how these formulation changes impact the product. Because when food manufacturers reduce sugar, they are not just replacing the sweetener, they're replacing all of the other functionality that sugars can bring to a product. Sugars don't just provide sweetness, they enhance the flavor and the aromas of foods. They add bulk, they help maintain color, texture, moisture in foods like cereals and breads, bars, or other bakery products. And sugar's an antimicrobial, so it also extends shelf life. So what is our role as registered dietitians? How can we keep sugar and non-sugar sweeteners in perspective as we give our recommendations? We want to personalize those recommendations, and we want to help consumers understand how their food and ingredient choices impact their broader dietary goals, including how these choices may play a role in weight management or overall health. Dr. Silvetsky will present her data today about sweeteners, which we hope will support you in drawing evidence-based conclusions and making evidence-based recommendations. And now I will move on to introducing our speaker today, Dr. Alison Silvetsky. Dr. Silvetsky is an associate professor and is vice chair of the Department of Exercise and Nutrition Sciences at the Milken Institute School of Public Health at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Her research focuses broadly on obesity and diabetes in youth. Her primary interests include studying the consumption and health effects of sugar-sweetened beverages and non-nutritive sweeteners, with a key focus on their consumption during childhood. Alison is the principal investigator of several externally funded research projects investigating the consumption, perceptions, and health effects of non-nutritive sweeteners, with recent or ongoing research funding from the National Institute of Health, the American Cancer Society, and the Healthy Eating Research Program. Dr. Slavetsky has a doctorate in nutrition and health sciences from Emory University and completed her postdoctoral training at the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Disease at the NIH. Welcome, Allison.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Roseanne, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here to present. As mentioned, I'll be focusing on research, including our own, on non-sugar sweeteners, and going first to provide some background on non-sugar sweeteners, talk about the role of non-sugar sweeteners in weight management and cardiometabolic disease, and then end with some future research needs as well as implications for research, for future research and also for implications for nutrition policy. So as Roseanne already mentioned, there's been a lot of emphasis on lowering the intake of added sugars, and there are many different ways to accomplish this, but some of the efforts are policy efforts, for example, sugar-sweetened beverage taxes, front-of-package nutrition labels calling attention to added sugar as well as saturated fat and sodium, healthy default policies, healthy procurement policies, and public awareness campaigns focused on added sugars. And while it's important to, lower added sugar and to help people to adhere to the dietary guidelines, this is not without other effects. And so, as was alluded to earlier, reducing added sugars isn't done in isolation. And what you can see here on this figure is that on the left-hand side, this is added sugar sales volume in terms of kilograms per capita, and you can see a decline from 2007 to 2025. And then on the right-hand side of the slide is non-sugar sweetener use in terms of sales volume in grams per capita. And you can see an increase over the same time period. And so while there have been declines in the use of added sugars in the food supply, there's been concomitant increases in the use of non-sugar sweeteners. And non-sugar sweeteners may be a term that you haven't heard a lot. This category of ingredients goes by a lot of different names, including artificial sweeteners, non-nutritive sweeteners, high-intensity sweeteners, sugar substitutes. But what we're talking about is this category of ingredients that are used to replace added sugars and are sweet but contain no or few calories. And you're likely familiar with a lot of these. These are some of the more common ones that are sold in packets that you see in the grocery store or on tabletops. For example, aspartame, sucralose, monk fruit, stevia, saccharin. So these are examples of low or no calorie sweeteners. And again, these are all different compounds. And this is a category of ingredients, but we tend to lump them together into this category of non-sugar sweeteners because they contain no or few calories and provide sweetness, and therefore are used in foods and beverages as replacements for added sugars. And while you often may think of non-sugar sweeteners as being in diet soda and these packets, of course they are, more and more so, non-sugar sweeteners are pervasive in the food supply. And this is the case in the United States, and also more and more so the case globally. And here are some of my favorite examples on this slide. Again, these are just a handful of examples to really show that non-sugar sweeteners are in a wide variety of product types across a wide variety of product categories. And so many people are surprised to see that frozen chicken nuggets, for example, sometimes can contain non-sugar sweeteners, or English muffins that aren't lighter diet, for example, honey wheat English muffins, kettle corn microwave popcorn, oatmeal that's labeled high fiber, right? So these are not obvious, but more and more so, many different types of products are using non-sugar sweeteners to lower the sugar and calorie content of these products. And given this trend, not only in the United States, but also globally, the World Health Organization 2 years ago in May of 2023 issued a guideline. And that guideline, based on a series of systematic reviews that were conducted, stated that non-sugar sweeteners should not be used as a means of achieving weight control or reducing the risk of non-communicable diseases. But this was a conditional recommendation due to a lack of certainty in the scientific evidence. And so the literature, the research is still evolving, but based on the existing literature, this is what the guideline stated. And the guideline was intended to be relevant for the general population, including children and adults of any age, but with the exception of people, specifically people with diabetes. And what the guideline really highlights when you read the full guideline and the accompanying systematic reviews is that there's a lot of uncertainty around the role of non-sugar sweeteners in the diet, which really leads to the question as to, is replacing added sugars with non-sugar sweeteners, or is replacing regular soda, for example, with diet soda, is this actually helpful or harmful for weight management and prevention of chronic disease? And there's been a lot of research activity in this area, which makes it an exciting but also very controversial field to really understand what are the role of these ingredients and in what contexts, are these potentially effective for weight management and chronic disease prevention versus could there be unintended adverse consequences? And so the first topic that I'll focus on a bit is weight management. And that's what people often think about when you hear the term non-sugar sweetener and replacing sugar. Oftentimes this is with the goal of weight loss or weight management. And what's interesting is that there have been quite a few randomized controlled trials that have looked at what the effects on body weight or BMI are when you replace sugar, usually in a sugar-sweetened beverage, with non-sugar sweeteners. And so the figure that I'm showing here, this is from a meta-analysis that was published a few years ago. It included 29 studies that replaced sugar with non-sugar sweeteners. And what the studies show, when you look at this overall plot, you can see by that diamond on the bottom, that overall, that replacement of sugar with non-sugar sweeteners did lead in randomized controlled trials to a modest decrease in body weight of about 1 kilogram. So when the sugars that people typically consume are replaced with non-sugar sweeteners, and I'll talk more about this shortly, this may be a useful tool for lowering body weight. And when we look at the data for energy intake, also from randomized controlled trials, we see a very similar picture, which is that there's also a decline of about 225 calories per day on average in energy intake when you're analyzing all of these studies that have systematically replaced sugar with non-sugar sweeteners. But what I find really intriguing, especially when we think about the current modern day food supply, is that when we compare non-sugar sweeteners to water or nothing or unsweetened alternatives, right? So not replacing sugar, but comparing these to another non-caloric unsweetened alternative, the story is very different. And what you can see here from the same meta-analysis is that in studies that have compared, and these are randomized trials, have compared non-sugar sweeteners to water or nothing, there's actually no effect on body weight at all. But for energy intake, the data also from randomized controlled trials shows that compared with consuming water or nothing, non-sugar sweetener intake actually increases energy intake by about 162 calories per day on average. And so this is about a bit counterintuitive. These are no or low calorie, but people who are randomly assigned to consume them compared to water or nothing actually have higher energy intake than consuming other non-caloric alternatives such as water. So when we look at the randomized controlled trials for weight management, what's clear is that the effects of non-sugar sweeteners really depend on the comparator. So the story is very different based on whether non-sugar sweeteners are compared to sugar versus being compared to consuming water or nothing or other unsweetened products. And the vast majority of these randomized controlled trials administer non-sugar sweeteners in beverages, most of which are sweetened with aspartame based on when these studies were done, or they're typically administered in capsules. And while that's very useful information, this does not reflect what I just showed a few slides ago, which is this pervasive use of non-sugar sweeteners in a wide variety of foods and beverages. Also, there have been very few randomized controlled trials conducted in children, but those that have been conducted are overall consistent with the literature in adults. And also, there's only been one randomized controlled trial that's directly compared the effects of different types of non-sugar sweeteners on body weight and showed that different non-sugar sweeteners may have different effects. And that makes sense because these are different compounds, but we tend to lump them all together. But when we look at data from observational studies, for example, prospective cohort studies that are large studies that follow people, large samples of participants over many years, we see a very different picture. And that's that consistently, and this is from a different meta-analysis, but consistently in observational studies, including large prospective cohort studies, intake of beverages with non-sugar sweeteners is actually associated with an increased risk of obesity. And so, of course, these studies cannot show causality, they're observational, but we do see a very different picture in the observational literature. And what's also interesting is that if you look at this top set of studies in this figure, these are for sugar sweetened beverages. So that that diamond sort of middle way down, that's the estimate overall for sugar sweetened beverages. The bottom grouping is for artificially sweetened beverages or beverages with non-sugar sweeteners. And when you look at the effect size or the magnitude of the association, the increase in obesity risk that's associated with consuming beverages that contain non-sugar sweeteners is actually similar to that for sugar sweetened beverages. So what about for cardiometabolic disease? So of course, we're not just concerned about obesity risk, but what that means for metabolic health and ultimately diet-related chronic disease. And because observational studies follow people for many years, they're capable of looking at some of these outcomes, for example, diabetes incidence of cardiovascular disease, etc. Whereas the randomized controlled trial literature typically looks at these intermediary outcomes. And so I'll rely on the observational data to show what the associations are for risk of chronic disease. But here, this is a study that, again, was a meta-analysis published in 2020, examining associations between the intake of non-sugar sweeteners and the risk of type 2 diabetes. And what you can see here, similar to what we saw for obesity, is that quite consistently, there's an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes in people that consume more beverages with non-sugar sweeteners. So their increased risk was about 15% in this analysis. And then looking at cardiovascular disease risk, a similar story. On the top here, you can see coronary heart disease. On the bottom is stroke, but the same story if you look at the overall estimate, which is that there is a slightly higher risk of both types of cardiovascular disease with increasing consumption of non-sugar sweeteners. And to spare you the details of going through every health outcome that was assessed, I'll show you the executive summary. This is a figure from the executive summary of the WHO guideline, which really puts the data from randomized controlled trials next to the observational data. And what's very interesting is that the story is different depending on what type of data you look at. And when it comes to randomized controlled trials, you see some of those green arrows. That means it's a good thing, right? That as I already mentioned, that replacing sugar with non-sugar sweeteners does lead to modest decreases in body weight and BMI, also lower sugar intake, lower energy intake. But again, this is when we're comparing non-sugar sweeteners to sugar. So when non-sugar sweeteners are being used as replacements for sugar. And then on the right-hand side are the observational data, and you see a lot of red arrows pointing the other direction. And consistent with the slides I just showed for diabetes and heart disease and obesity risk, the observational data overall show that consumption of non-sugar sweeteners is associated with a higher risk of various diet-related chronic diseases, as well as a higher risk of all-cause mortality. And so when you put these next to each other, it's hard because you're getting two different stories depending on these different types of studies. And also we have to think about the context, which I'll talk about quite a bit more later. But given these observational findings that show that consumption of beverages of non-sugar sweeteners and non-sugar sweeteners from other sources in some of the studies as well are linked to a higher risk of diet-related disease, it begs the question of why. And one explanation is that because these observational studies have inherent flaws, specifically reverse causality and residual confounding, is this just inherently because these are observational studies? Are what we're seeing just spurious associations that are due to these flaws in design and not real? That's a possibility. But while reverse causality and residual confounding are certainly contributing, I would posit, after many years of researching this topic, that that's not the only possible explanation. And so while certainly reverse causality and residual confounding are contributing, there have been a variety of mechanisms that have been proposed and that have been gaining more and more support, not only in rodents, but also in humans over the past several decades. And these mechanisms, some of which are biological, and I'll go through these in a moment, and some are more behavioral, but both are important to consider when we think about the role of non-sugar sweeteners when it comes to weight management and chronic disease prevention. So to walk you through some of these, and I won't go into them in detail in the interest of time, but I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A. Some of the mechanisms that have been proposed include that non-sugar sweeteners may disrupt insulin and glucose homeostasis, increasing the risk of diabetes. And this has actually been shown in humans where there have been studies that have administered, for example, sucralose to humans over 2 to 4 weeks and have actually shown reductions in insulin sensitivity or increases in insulin resistance. There's also been some work looking at the effects of non-sugar sweeteners on adipogenesis, and it's been proposed that these non-sugar sweeteners may promote adipogenesis and fat accumulation. There's also been a lot of interest in the role of non-sugar sweeteners in altering the gut microbiome. There have been a few really interesting studies, including randomized controlled trials in humans, that have shown that various non-sugar sweeteners may alter the gut microbiome, leading to adverse effects on the host metabolism. There's also a lot of interest in changes in taste preferences because non-sugar sweeteners are sweet, but do not contain calories or contain very few calories. There's been questions around whether this sweetness may actually lead people to prefer more sweetness or dysregulate the way that the brain responds to sugar, but that's an area of active investigation. There's also been some really interesting work on taste receptors. It may be a surprise to some that sweet taste receptors are not only located in the mouth and the oral cavity, but also are actually located throughout the whole body, including on our pancreatic beta cells that secrete insulin, and including in our enteroendocrine L cells that release satiety hormones like GLP-1. And so in a petri dish, incubating these cell lines with non-sugar sweeteners such as sucralose or saccharin, for example, actually leads to a release in insulin or a release in GLP-1. But whether that is clinically meaningful in humans is still under investigation. Other mechanisms include potential increases in systemic inflammation, as well as alterations in how our brain responds to sugar and potential dysregulation of appetite pathways in the brain. So all of this to say, there's a lot of mechanisms that have been proposed that may explain how non-sugar sweeteners and diet beverages may actually causally impact some of these outcomes, but the evidence is far from conclusive. It's also important to think about the behavior because the way that these non-sugar sweeteners have traditionally been studied in randomized controlled trials is in a very controlled way, and that again provides very important data. But we have to ask ourselves, to what extent do those findings reflect the way that these non-sugar sweeteners are consumed in real life? And so just to give you a few examples, these are some of the products you already saw on a prior slide, but many people, and we've worked on this topic extensively, are completely unaware that the products that they're choosing contain non-sugar sweeteners. So first of all, are people intentionally choosing these products to lower sugar? In many cases, probably not, though this is also something that requires further study. Whereas in many of the randomized controlled trials, people know that they're being asked to replace their usual sugar-sweetened beverage with the diet beverage. And in the RCTs, they're also often receiving intensive behavioral support for weight loss. They're cognitively engaged in weight loss. And that's likely not the case for someone that's just grabbing an English muffin or a box of microwave kettle corn popcorn. Also, given the types of products that non-sugar sweeteners are found in, and actually my favorite isn't even on this slide that I've seen a lot recently, is in pickled ginger that goes on sushi. I like that one, I should have put it here. But I don't think anyone's putting, pickled ginger on their sushi in an effort to lower sugar, right? So the question is also, is this a substitution or is this an addition? Are these really replacing added sugar or are they being consumed in addition to added sugar? And then also in real life, right, we're getting non-sugar sweeteners from many sources, not just beverages. And some of these cohort studies follow people for much longer, as opposed to these RCTs that are relatively short. And so both of these types of studies, provide very important information. But whether just testing these in an RCT, right, and showing modest weight loss is applicable to the current context of the food supply is a different question. So with that in mind, my group has done some work recently in collaboration with the American Cancer Society to analyze data from some of their very large cohorts, in particular the Cancer Prevention Study 3 cohort, where about 163,000 participants had completed an 191-item food frequency questionnaire. And so we did a cross-sectional analysis that was published recently, where we analyzed the amount of foods and beverages that people reported consuming that contain non-sugar sweeteners. And we separated the cohort into 4 groups: non-consumers of non-sugar sweeteners, those that were low consumers that consume less than 1 serving per day of a product with non-sugar sweeteners, 1 to 2 servings per day, or more than 2 servings per day. And we were interested in diet quality, and so we used two different outcomes for diet quality. One was the American Cancer Society Diet Score, which measures alignment with cancer prevention guidelines. And the other was the Healthy Eating Index 2015, which measures alignment with the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And the findings were quite interesting. So just to orient you to this figure, and actually I'll show you both of them because the results are essentially the same. Now, looking at the ACS diet score data on the left or the HEI 2015 data on the right, you can see that compared to the group in black, which are the non-consumers of non-sugar sweeteners, those that consumed non-sugar sweeteners, and those people are shown in blue, had lower overall diet quality using both of these indices compared to non-consumers. And as the blue bars get darker, that is reflective of higher consumption of non-sugar sweeteners. And what you can see is that using either index, the ACS diet score or the healthy eating index, that the participants that consumed more, so 2 or more servings per day, had the lowest overall diet quality. And you might be wondering, what do these numbers mean? But actually, a difference of 4 or 5 points on the healthy eating index is believed to be potentially, clinically relevant. So that is a fairly large difference when you look at the group in the dark blue for HEI that has, 71.98 versus 75.5 for the non-consumers. So that is a meaningful difference, though it's not a huge difference. But overall, regardless of the index used, those that consume more non-sugar sweeteners actually had lower overall diet quality, which is, again, a bit counterintuitive. And we've also done some similar work in children. This was using data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And what you can see here, this was about 7,000 children from 3 different cycles of the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And in this figure that I'm showing here, we were looking at energy intake. Of course, this is cross-sectional using NHANES, but we divided these children into, again, 4 groups. One was in blue, that's the children that did not consume any sweetened beverages, they only consumed water or unsweetened beverages. In the gray are children that reported consuming beverages with non-sugar sweeteners. Here I have it as LCSB for low-calorie sweetened beverages, but those are the non-sugar sweetener group. The group in the black, those are kids that consume sugary beverages. And then the group that has the pattern actually consumed both low-calorie sweetened beverages and sugary beverages. And what you can see for energy intake is that compared to the water group, those that consumed low-calorie sweetened beverages or sugary beverages had higher energy intake, and those that consumed both had the highest energy intake. And so the group that consumed low-calorie sweetened beverages actually had similar energy intake to the sugary beverage group, again, kind of challenging this notion that non-sugar sweeteners lower total energy intake, though of course these are cross-sectional data and we cannot, extrapolate this to cause an effect. So speaking of children, another really interesting question that my group is actively studying is how consuming non-sugar sweeteners during critical life stages such as pregnancy and lactation may affect both the mother and the baby's health. And so we know from analyses that we've done over the years that about 24% of pregnant women in the United States report consuming products with non-sugar sweeteners. We know from a lot of work that we've done extensively characterizing transmission of non-sugar sweeteners in breast milk that babies are exposed to non-sugar sweeteners through the breast milk. And we also know, based on some recent work that we've done that was published last year, that about 1/3 of infants and young children in the United States consume a food or beverage with non-sugar sweeteners on a given day. So we know there's early life exposure, but what we don't know is what the effects of this early life exposure might be when it comes to taste preferences, diet, metabolic health, and ultimately future risk of diet-related chronic disease. And so what's also interesting is that similar to in adults, there's been some observational work looking at the effects of, or the associations between maternal consumption of non-sugar sweeteners during pregnancy and health outcomes. And there are some concerning associations, a higher risk of preterm birth, higher gestational weight gain for the mom, and then also for the baby, higher risk of obesity in infancy and childhood, as well as alterations in the infant's gut microbiome and fecal metabolites. But again, these are observational data, and there has not to date been a randomized controlled trial to look at this question, but we're actually doing one right now, which is really exciting. That started in September. It will be going on for the next several years, but we're actually doing the first randomized controlled trial to examine how does restricting non-sugar sweeteners during pregnancy and or lactation impact the mother's health and the baby's health as well. So there'll be more data to come on that topic, but a really important and interesting area. So just to summarize this part of the presentation on health effects, the effects of non-sugar sweeteners when it comes to energy intake and body weight depend on the comparator. And most of these different sweeteners really have been tested in the form of beverages or in capsules, which may not reflect the current food supply. But we know that non-sugar sweetener consumption is associated with lower diet quality and higher risk of obesity and diet-related chronic disease in observational studies, but we need more research to understand the underlying physiological mechanisms. And while there are observational data to suggest that intake of non-sugar sweeteners during pregnancy and lactation may have adverse effects on offspring and maternal health, that is something that is actively understudied, but that we also need more research on quite urgently. So in terms of key research needs, there are many, but I'll just highlight a few here. One is to understand sweetness. Is sweetness problematic, or are the effects that we're seeing compound specific? So sucralose versus saccharin versus stevia, for example. Also, what about other replacements for added sugars like sweet proteins, right? What about natural sweeteners versus artificial ones? We tend to lump these together, but how are these similar? How are they different? What about when they're used together in blends, as is often the case? Also, what amount of exposure leads to unfavorable health outcomes? We often hear people referring to the acceptable daily intake, which is based on toxicology data. And of course, we want to make sure we're below the acceptable daily intake. But how much exposure is needed to change the gut microbiome or change insulin sensitivity? And we don't know the answer to that question. Also, are there some population subgroups that are more sensitive to non-sugar sweeteners? And are some of these perturbations that have been shown in relatively small and short-term trials, how clinically relevant are they? Do they really lead to an increased risk of cardiometabolic disease? And then finally, what are the effects of early life exposure? We know there is early life exposure, but should we be concerned with regard to infants and children's future cardiometabolic health? So to switch gears a little bit here, I've talked to you very briefly about a very evolving body of evidence focused on understanding the metabolic and health effects of these sweeteners. But at the same time, while all this research is being done that takes years, if not decades, there is massive policy effort focused on lowering intake of nutrients of public health concern, including added sugars. And so what I'm showing here is a figure from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill that shows, this is just one example of a nutrition policy, but shows front of package labeling policies globally. And so you can see here that there are many countries globally that have various front of package labeling policies. And there are a lot, particularly in Latin America, where you can see some of these octagonal warnings that say, high in calories, etc. But what is also notable is that there are only a few countries, including Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia, that also have a warning for non-sugar sweeteners. And so most of these policies do not consider non-sugar sweeteners, though there are a few that do, and I'll talk more about that shortly as well. And of course, as you're all aware, the FDA has issued a proposed rule on front of package nutrition labeling, and this was proposed back in January. But a question in my mind, as someone who studies non-sugar sweeteners, is will such a policy, will a label that calls attention to added sugar, further increase the use of non-sugar sweeteners? And based on what we've seen globally, likely the answer is yes. And a great example of this comes from Chile. And this is one paper that I think really puts it very clearly into context. And this came out after the Chilean law of food labeling and advertising was implemented in 2016. And this paper really calls attention to the overuse of non-caloric or non-sugar sweeteners in foods and beverages in Chile, and goes as far to question, is this a threat to consumers' free choice? Because what they point out in this paper is that in some product categories, including products consumed by children, that there are no options that do not contain non-sugar sweeteners. And there's been several evaluations of the Chilean food supply and also of non-sugar sweetener intake after the implementation of this law. And what they've consistently shown is that there's been an increase in the intake and use of non-sugar sweeteners. And so again, not surprising, but sort of foreshadowing of what's likely to come elsewhere as policies continue to be implemented on lowering added sugar without considering the unintended consequences with regard to non-sugar sweeteners. But what's concerning, given these trends, is that in addition to the WHO guideline that I mentioned earlier, there's been several organizations that previously have put out guidelines stating that non-sugar sweeteners are not recommended specifically for children. And so the guideline on the top left here, this is from the American Heart Association. The bottom two examples are from Healthy Eating Research based on consensus statements from several health organizations, including the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And all of them advise against consumption of non-sugar sweetener containing beverages by children. So even though, there's controversy for children, most of these organizations have taken more of a cautious stance, which is that given the lack of evidence, given the uncertainty, and given the potential for harm, they recommend against consumption of beverages with non-sugar sweeteners for kids. However, when we look at our food supply, this is what we see, right? There are more and more children's beverages that contain non-sugar sweeteners, often multiple non-sugar sweeteners in combination. These are clearly marketed directly to children, just looking at the packaging, even with the branding blurred out, right? And also, these often contain added sugars. So again, raising the question of to what extent are we really substituting these versus adding these in addition to added sugar? Some of these beverages are typically thought of as sugary drinks, and they are, but now they also often contain sucralose, for example, or stevia. And we know from data from several groups, but particularly this study from the Rudd Center, that parents of young children in particular really don't recognize that these children's beverages contain non-sugar sweeteners. And in this particular study, the investigators did an experiment where they recruited a fairly large sample of parents, and they randomized them to see children's drinks that contain non-sugar sweeteners. And they either saw them with just the front of the package, or they saw the front of package and as well as the nutrition or ingredient information. And what was really striking is that the majority of parents could not identify beverages that contain non-sugar sweeteners. And this was true even when they saw the ingredients information, right? So even showing parents these long ingredients lists on beverages, they still can't identify which products contain non-sugar sweeteners. And that's important because we've talked to many parents and done focus groups, as have others. And parents often say they don't want to provide them to their child, yet they're doing exactly that unknowingly. And so given this phenomenon, that's not just limited to the United States, as mentioned earlier, some countries, such as Mexico, have actually implemented front-of-package nutrition labels to more explicitly call attention to the presence of non-sugar sweeteners in food and beverage products. And so you can see there circled in red, this is a label in Mexico. There's a required box that says contains sweeteners, not recommended for children. And what's interesting is that there was just a paper that came out a couple months ago from Mexico looking at product reformulation before and after implementation of their front-of-pack warning policy. And what they showed is actually there was not an increase in the use of non-sugar sweeteners, rather there was a reduction in products with non-sugar sweeteners after the policy. So because the label called attention to them, there wasn't this same trend of massive reformulation to contain non-sugar sweeteners that we saw in countries such as Chile. And so given this interest and given the proposed front-of-pack label that could be implemented in the United States, my group recently did a randomized control trial with a large sample of parents of kids 2 to 12 that we recruited from throughout the United States. And we did this experiment after doing a series of focus groups and also a survey to understand what type of messaging would resonate with parents. And that's how these labels were decided on. But in this trial, we randomized parents to one of 3 arms. They saw the same types of products, but they saw them either with no front-of-pack labels, so kind of as they are now, a front-of-pack label for added sugars, so kind of what is the case in many countries and what would be, but not for non-sugar sweeteners, or a front-of-package label both for added sugars and for non-sugar sweeteners. And I'll show you a picture of this so that it makes more sense. So if you see here, there are the 3 groups, right? So going from down the left-hand side, group 1 was no front-of-pack label, that's the control. Group 2 was a front-of-pack label for added sugars. And group 3 was the both label group. They saw the same for drinks. And so you can see these 4 drinks across the rows. And these are real products that are sold in the UK. We chose UK products so that they were real and in English, but so that people didn't have the influence of pre-existing brand preferences. But the drink on the left column, that one was unsweetened. The drink on the second from the left, that one contained only added sugars, no non-sugar sweeteners. The third one contained non-sugar sweeteners, but not added sugar. And the fourth one contained both. And so you can see how the labels looked based on the group, right? The control group on the top, it was just a control label, a barcode. The middle group, if the product had added sugar, they saw an added sugar label. But if the product contained non-sugar sweeteners, like the third one, they didn't see a label. But then the last group saw a label for added sugar, where there was added sugar, and for non-sugar sweeteners, where there were non-sugar sweeteners, which is why for that last product on the bottom right, they actually saw 2 labels. So we showed fruit drinks. We also showed yogurts using the same design, right? So we did foods and beverages. I won't walk you through this because it's exactly the same as for the fruit drinks. But what we found was striking. And that's that, again, these were the same products, but the labels were different. And if you look at this figure, on the left are fruit drinks, and on the right are yogurt. And the gray bar is the control group that didn't see any front of pack label. They just saw the control barcode label. The group in black was the group that saw the added sugar front of pack labels for products with added sugar, but not the non-sugar sweetener one. And the group with the dashed lines saw both labels. So again, if the product had added sugar, they saw added sugar label. Non-sugar sweeteners, they saw non-sugar sweetener label. If it had both, they saw 2 labels. And what you can see here is that the likelihood of parents selecting the unsweetened product was significantly higher in the group that saw both front of pack labels. So those who saw the control, about a third of them chose the unsweetened product, similar for added sugar, but it was almost twice as high of a percentage of the sample when they saw both labels. So seeing both labels, so not only the added sugar label, but also the non-sugar sweetener label, really encouraged parents to hypothetically, of course it was an online experiment, but hypothetically choose the unsweetened and healthier product for their child. So having the 2 labels was useful. And what was equally interesting, and this again, the findings were the same for fruit drinks and yogurts, is if you look at the added sugar group here, this figure is for selecting the product with non-sugar sweeteners. So I just showed you the data looking at choosing the unsweetened product. And the group that saw both labels was much more likely to do so. But what I'm showing here is the likelihood of selecting the product that contained non-sugar sweeteners. And what you can see very clearly is this much higher percentage in the group that only saw the added sugar label, right? So when parents see a label that calls attention to added sugars in products, but not non-sugar sweeteners, they switch to choosing the non-sugar sweetener containing product. And so you can see that this was significantly higher both for the fruit drink and the yogurt, that when parents did not see the non-sugar sweetener label, but they only saw the added sugar one, they were less likely to choose the added sugar product, but they instead were more likely to choose the product with non-sugar sweeteners, which of course is concerning given the uncertainty around the effects of non-sugar sweeteners in children. So parents who only saw the added sugar from the pack label were more likely to choose the product with non-sugar sweeteners, and this was true both for fruit drinks and yogurts. So just to summarize here, there's been a massive increase or market increase in the use of non-sugar sweeteners in the food supply. This has been the case in North America and also globally. Front of pack labels for added sugars and non-sugar sweeteners in combination encourage parents to choose the unsweetened products, whereas only seeing the label for added sugars encourages parents to choose products with non-sugar sweeteners for their children. So knowing this and knowing the policy, landscape, we really think that added sugar reduction efforts should focus on replacement with unsweetened or minimally sweetened options in order to avoid the potential unintended consequences of non-sugar sweetener intake. And in the meantime, there's a lot more research that needs to be done. We've recently published a couple commentaries really calling attention to the urgency of this issue. We need more research to understand the effects of non-sugar sweeteners, but in the meantime, especially when it comes to children, we think that it's time for transparency and more caution because we really don't want to experiment on our children, and we need to do the research before it's too late. So thank you, and I'll pass it back to Roseanne for if there's any questions.
Excellent. There are a lot of questions. We certainly need more research. We're flooding the market with so many different products, and it's confusing for consumers. It's even confusing for us. So I'm going to dive right into questions. I probably won't get to all of them, but I'm going to summarize a few. First one, Allison, thank you, by the way, for an excellent presentation. Is it possible that the increase in risk for diabetes or cardiovascular disease is in people who are predisposed already? And do you have any idea which non-sugar sweetener is the cause of these negative health effects?
That's a great question. So to answer the first part of the question, these observational studies control for things like family history of diabetes. And so certainly there may be, as I mentioned, some residual confounding that we can't control for in these studies that is contributing, but that's unlikely to be the only driver, right? So we need to think about not just, yes, that's possible, but is that the full explanation? And possibly not, right? And so it's definitely a fair question and one that needs to be considered, but it's not only, in people that have a family history of diabetes, for example, or who are already metabolically, less healthy. And then to answer your second question, I wish we had a better answer. And we, as a field, this is, in my opinion, one of the most important research questions to address is how are these non-sugar sweeteners similar or different from each other? Because we do not have good data on that, and that is critical, not only for people making decisions, but also for industry in terms of formulation of products, and also for regulation and policy, right? Should we be saying contains non-sugar sweeteners if some might be actually helpful and others may be harmful, and we just don't know the answer. We need the data.
All right, lots more data. So the studies you mentioned early in the presentation that some of the non-sugar sweeteners studies in beverages were aspartame. So does the totality of the evidence include other sweeteners? Do they differentiate natural sweeteners like stevia? And what dose is typical in these studies?
Great question. So the majority of the studies that I showed in terms of the RCTs used aspartame in beverages because until the last couple of decades, most beverages were sweetened with aspartame or saccharin. Now there's less saccharin, but we still have a lot of aspartame is the main sweetener in diet soda, right? Diet beverages. But as mentioned, there are many different types of beverage products and product categories that now contain very different combinations of sweeteners than what we would have seen even 10 or 20 years ago. And so it's not that the other sweeteners haven't been studied. There have been some studies, that have just looked at, sucralose capsules or something like that, but they're not, because the food and beverage supply has evolved so rapidly, the way that these studies are done just doesn't necessarily reflect how they're consumed, right? People aren't just consuming a diet soda to replace a sugary drink. They're having, all different exposures from all different sources. And then to answer the second question, it is nearly impossible in these observational studies in particular to differentiate between sweetener types, but even more impossible to know the amount because the amounts are not publicly disclosed. And so we don't know. So typically these observational studies are looking at, ounces or volume of beverages that contain non-sugar sweeteners as opposed to milligrams of non-sugar sweeteners. And if they do have milligrams, it's a very rough estimate. But even if you think about a food frequency questionnaire where it asks you, how often do you consume diet soda, right? Or diet beverages, you don't know what the beverage is, right? So there's just not that specificity, which makes it really hard to disentangle.
Yeah, the labeling issue, in those products like chicken nuggets or English muffins, most families aren't thinking that is going to have a non-sugar sweetener in it. All right. And, essentially, the audience wants to know, like, what are we going to recommend? Should we recommend avoiding a sugar sweetened beverage and replacing it with a non-sugar sweetened beverage? The question is really the portion and the dose. All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to comment on that, I wish there was a simple, more straightforward answer, but I think it really, I mean, again, you're dietitians, right? So you're clinical, and I'm not a clinician, so I can't really make recommendations for individuals, right? But I mean, I think it depends on the individual's tastes. And in some contexts, this could be a useful tool. But on a population level, there may be a different answer, right? Especially again, as we're seeing the evolving food supply in response to reductions to lower added sugars.
Right. Yeah, this question, would it be appropriate to encourage non-sugar sweeteners for patients seeking weight loss while warning them about the increased risk for type 2 diabetes? That data is really interesting. Or do you recommend cold turkey style and just eliminating added sugars in beverages, or the alternative?
So again, I can't make a
Those are
clinical
correlational,
recommendation.
right?
But I mean, I think that the randomized controlled trial data that I showed are pretty consistent and clear, which is that when they're used carefully, right, as a replacement for sugary drinks, if you have someone who already drinks a lot of sugary drinks, they replace it with a diet beverage and are really trying to manage their weight through a variety of different measures, right, it may be a useful tool. And so I certainly don't think the data warrant, villainizing these as a void in all cases, but I think we need to be cautious and also really think about the context.
Right. And I'll let you comment quickly on this question. Asked, should we be lumping all of these different no sugar ingredients together? As you mentioned, some studies, more studies are needed for some of them. And is there potential for interaction between these sweeteners and other components of the food matrix?
Yeah, so I think ideally we would not lump them together because again, they're different ingredients, but based on the data that we have, right? And the fact that it's very hard to even know what is what or how much of one or the other, right? I don't think we really have a choice but to lump them together when we're talking about these to the public, right? I mean, is the public going to know acesulfame potassium versus sucralose? I mean, and so again, I think that we need to do that research to be able to have that guidance or know which is which in terms of what we're recommending or recommending against. But at this point, these are all used as substitutes for sugar and they're not essential dietary components. And that was also really highlighted by the dietary or by the WHO guideline, which is like, if these are not necessary and we are concerned, then why would we recommend consuming them essentially?
Right. And back to some of your data, it was this slide with the blue bar graph where you non-sugar sweeteners and diet quality. What was defined as the non-consumer?
Yeah, non-consumers were people who did not report consuming any of the foods and beverages on the questionnaire that contained non-sugar sweeteners. So they checked 0 for diet beverages, for light fruit juice, for light yogurt, for any of the sweetener packets. So then I think what that question might be getting at is that people are probably exposed without knowing it. So of course, non-consumer may not be 100% accurate because these are in toothpaste and mouthwash, right? So I mean, we've done a lot of work on this too, where people who say, oh, I avoid them entirely, no, they still have some in their urine, right? But I mean, so essentially non-consumers in terms of reported dietary intake.
And do you have any comment on sugar in the microbiome? You mentioned the non-sugar sweeteners and how it may affect the microbiome.
It's a good question. I don't have really any comments other than I know there's a trial going on right now out of the University of Toronto where they're actually systematically comparing effects of sugar versus non-sugar sweeteners versus water on the gut microbiome. And I believe those data are forthcoming.
All right. Okay, let's see. This question. You mentioned there was a random control trial that examined the differences between sweeteners. What were the results of this study? And do you know which sweetener was associated with the greatest risk of weight gain or adverse health outcomes?
Yeah. So thank you for asking that question. In the interest of time, I didn't include the actual data. But yes, this was a study that came out 5 years ago or so out of Purdue. And what they showed was actually, it was an RCT that had several arms comparing different non-sugar sweeteners and also sucrose. And what they showed was that those who were randomized to consume saccharin actually had the highest weight gain. And those that were randomized to consume sucralose showed weight loss, which was interesting to show these differences, whereas aspartame and stevia were actually similar to the sucrose group.
There's a lot of questions about the natural sweeteners versus the artificial non-sugar sweeteners.
About natural versus artificial?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, again, I think it's something that, consumers believe, right? They believe that because something is natural, it's healthier, or safer. And I think that, also there's a lot of marketing to promote that narrative. And we just don't have the data because if you're going to have a stevia sweetened cookie or a sucralose sweetened cookie, it's still a cookie too, right? So I mean, we have to think bigger picture beyond just ingredients, but also, again, someone had mentioned the overall food matrix. So those are the studies that we need to do, and we just need to be able to do them. But at this point, the idea of natural versus artificial is sort of there's not a lot of science to back that up.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Allison. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your fabulous questions. Leslie's going to wrap it up.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you guys both so very much. I have not seen this many questions in both the chat and the Q&A box in a webinar in a while. So we really appreciate your participation, everyone. Thanks again, Roseanne and Allison. There was a lot of excitement for the presentation, and we're really grateful for you both to share your experience with us. And with that, we've come to the end of the webinar. Your attendance certificates are now available to download. You can follow the instructions on the screen or refer to the final slide of the presentation handout for information on how to complete the evaluation and grab your certificate. The credit claiming email with these same instructions will be sent out within the next 24 hours. That will also contain the links to download the handouts, the presentation slides, the reference list. If you missed those earlier today, they are also in the credit claiming email. So you can grab those from there if you didn't get them yet. And thanks again, Roseanne. Thanks again, Allison, and everyone for joining us. We really appreciate you, and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. We'll see you next time.